Have you ever witnessed something so unjust that it made your blood boil? Imagine seeing an elderly veteran being assaulted at a bus stop by a ruthless biker. Now imagine the look on the attacker's face when 20 minutes later, an entire military unit roars up on motorcycles. Stay with me until the end to discover how this powerful story of brotherhood and justice unfolded in ways no one could have predicted. Welcome to Honor Echoes, where we share the extraordinary stories of veterans that remind us all about courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds formed in service. Before we dive into today's remarkable story, take a moment to subscribe to our channel to hear more inspiring tales of veterans whose echoes of honor continue to resonate in our world today. I'll never forget that cold Tuesday morning in October. The sky was overcast, threatening rain. As I waited at the bus stop on Willow Street, just across from Miller's Diner, I was running late for my shift at the Veterans Outreach Center, nervously checking my watch every 30 seconds as if that would somehow make the bus arrive faster. There weren't many people at the stop that morning, just me, a young woman with headphones, and an elderly gentleman who immediately caught my attention. He was tall but slightly stooped with age, probably in his 70s, wearing a weathered Navy veteran cap with pride. His jacket was impeccably clean, adorned with a few service pins, and he stood with the kind of posture that only comes from military discipline. I nodded respectfully in his direction, and he returned the gesture with a slight smile. There's an unspoken understanding between those who recognize military service, a quiet acknowledgement of shared values. I was about to introduce myself when the rumble of motorcycles drowned out all other sounds. 3 bikers pulled up to the curb about 20 feet from our bus stop. They weren't the friendly weekend riders you might see touring the countryside. These guys had that dangerous edge: leather jackets covered in patches, chains hanging from their jeans, and faces that seemed permanently set in scowls. I noticed the elderly veteran tense slightly, his eyes tracking their movements with the alertness of someone who's seen combat. The largest of the 3 dismounted his bike and headed toward the convenience store behind us, brushing past the old veteran with unnecessary force. The contact was brief but deliberate, a shoulder check that caused the elderly man to stumble slightly. "Watch where you're standing, old man," the biker growled, his voice carrying the raspy edge of someone who'd had too many cigarettes and not enough kindness in his life. What happened next still plays in my mind like slow motion. The veteran straightened his back, looked the biker directly in the eyes, and spoke with quiet dignity. "Young man, there's plenty of sidewalk for everyone. No need for discourtesy." Now, those measured words, delivered without anger but with unmistakable authority, seemed to trigger something primal in the biker. Perhaps it was being called young man by someone he viewed as weak, or maybe it was the calm correction that challenged his perceived dominance. Whatever the reason, his reaction was as swift as it was shocking. The biker's face contorted with rage. "You think you're something special with your little hat," he snarled, flicking the brim of the veteran's Navy cap. "What are you gonna do about it, Grandpa?" The bus stop suddenly felt charged with tension. The young woman with headphones had backed away, her eyes wide with fear. I took a step forward, not sure what I could do against someone twice my size, but knowing I couldn't just stand by. Before I could intervene, the situation escalated beyond words. When the veteran didn't cower or respond with fear, the biker's anger seemed to boil over. With a sudden movement, he shoved the elderly man backward. The veteran, trying to maintain his balance, reached out to steady himself against the bus shelter. Seeing this as some sort of challenge, the biker followed through with a punch that caught the veteran on the jaw, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. "Frank, what the hell, man?" one of the other bikers called out, clearly uncomfortable with the assault on an elderly person. "Leave him alone. Let's go." But Frank, as I now knew him, wasn't finished. He stood over the fallen veteran who was struggling to get up, a trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. "Not so tough now, are you, soldier boy?" Frank taunted, reaching down to grab the navy cap that had fallen to the ground. He twirled it mockingly on his finger. Something inside me snapped. I rushed forward, placing myself between the biker and the veteran. "That's enough!" I shouted, my voice stronger than I felt. "He's a veteran who served this country. Show some respect or back off." Frank's attention turned to me, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "Mind your own business unless you want the same," he threatened, taking a step toward me. Just then, the young woman who had been standing nearby shouted, "I'm calling the police!" She had her phone out, already dialing. This seemed to give Frank pause. His two companions were now off their bikes, calling for him to leave it alone. After a tense moment, Frank spat on the ground near the veteran's feet, threw the navy cap down, and turned away. "Not worth my time," he muttered. "Bunch of patriots crying about a little push." The three bikers mounted their motorcycles and roared away, leaving a cloud of exhaust and tension in their wake. I immediately turned my attention to the veteran, helping him to his feet and retrieving his cap. "Are you all right, sir? We should call an ambulance." The old man straightened his jacket with dignity and wiped the blood from his lip with a handkerchief he produced from his pocket. "No need for that, son. I've had worse from training exercises." His voice was steady, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. Not from the physical pain, but from the indignity of the assault. "I'm Richard," he said, extending his hand. "Lieutenant Commander Richard Harmon, retired." "James," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "It's an honor to meet you, sir, though I wish it were under better circumstances." The young woman approached cautiously. "The police are on their way," she said. "That was completely unacceptable. Are you sure you're okay?" Richard nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, miss. I'll be fine. Been standing on my own 2 feet since before you were born." There was no bitterness in his voice, just the matter-of-fact statement of a man who had faced hardships before. As we waited for the police, Richard told me a little about his service. 26 years in the Navy, including 2 tours in Vietnam. He'd been headed to the VA hospital for his regular checkup when the incident occurred. I shared that I worked at the Veterans Outreach Center, helping former military personnel navigate benefits and services. When the police arrived about 10 minutes later, they took our statements and descriptions of the bikers. The officers were respectful toward Richard, one of them being a former Marine himself. They promised to look for the suspects, but admitted it might be difficult without license plate numbers. After the police left, I offered to accompany Richard to the VA hospital, but he insisted he was fine to go alone. The bus was approaching, and he straightened his cap with a determined gesture. "Don't worry about me, James. This old sailor has weathered worse storms." As the bus pulled up, Richard turned to board it. Just then, the distant sound of motorcycles caught our attention. My heart sank, thinking Frank and his friends had returned. But what rounded the corner wasn't 3 bikers. It was a convoy of at least 15 motorcycles, moving in perfect formation. Richard froze, his hand on the bus door, a look of disbelief crossing his face. The riders were older men, most with gray hair visible beneath their helmets. Their motorcycles were a mix of classic American models, many adorned with military insignia and American flags. This wasn't a gang. It was a veterans motorcycle club. The lead rider, a barrel-chested man with a silver beard, raised his hand, and the entire group pulled to the curb in a choreographed maneuver that spoke of military precision. As one, they dismounted and removed their helmets. The leader approached Richard with purpose in his stride. "Lieutenant Commander Harmon," he said, snapping to attention and offering a crisp salute. "Chief Petty Officer Marcus Delaney, sir. Reporting with the men of Naval Special Warfare Group 8, 1972-1975. Richard's composure broke for the first time that morning. His eyes widened in recognition, and for a moment I thought he might fall. Instead, he straightened to his full height and returned the salute with military precision. "Chief Delaney," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What in God's name are you doing here?" Marcus Delaney broke into a wide grin. "We were at the American Legion Hall planning our Veterans Day ride when Billy's daughter called. She was on her way to work and saw the whole thing." He gestured to the young woman with headphones, who was watching the scene unfold with amazement. "You're Wilhelmina?" Richard asked incredulously. "Bill Thompson's little girl?" She nodded, smiling. "Everyone calls me Mina now. Dad talks about you all the time, Commander. When I realized who you were, I called him right away." Another rider stepped forward, this one leaning on a cane but standing tall nonetheless. "Couldn't let it stand, Commander. Not after everything we've been through." Richard's face transformed as he recognized another old comrade. One by one, the riders approached, each one a former member of Richard's unit or someone who had served under his command. Some had traveled from neighboring states for the Veterans Day gathering, a yearly tradition they maintained decades after their service had ended. The reunion was interrupted when one of the riders, a man called Doc, who had been their medic, insisted on checking Richard's injuries. After confirming they were minor, the group's attention turned to more pressing matters. "Where are they?" asked a rider with "Gunny" embroidered on his leather vest, his voice carrying the quiet danger of a man who knew how to handle trouble. Richard shook his head. "Let it go, Gunny. It's not worth it." "All due respect, sir," Marcus interjected. "But when someone puts hands on one of our own, it doesn't go unanswered. We're not looking for trouble, but we are going to have a conversation." The determination in their faces made it clear this wasn't up for debate. These weren't hot-headed young men looking for a fight. They were seasoned veterans who understood the consequences of violence all too well. But they also lived by a code that demanded respect for their brothers in arms. Richard sighed, recognizing the resolve in his former unit. "They headed toward Pike Street, probably to that bar on the corner, Rusty's Tavern. But listen to me," he said, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had once guided these men through perilous waters. "No violence. We're better than that." Marcus nodded solemnly. "No violence," he agreed. "Just a conversation about respect and consequences." The group formed a circle around Richard, their brotherhood palpable in the way they stood together. Men who had faced death side by side and formed bonds that neither time nor distance could break. They insisted Richard join them for lunch after his VA appointment, promising to escort him safely to the hospital, and then to their gathering at the American Legion Hall. As they prepared to depart, Richard turned to me. "James, thank you for standing up when it mattered. Not many would have done that." I felt humbled by his gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same, sir." He shook his head. "No, son, not anyone. Remember that." He handed me a card with his contact information. "The Outreach Center, you said. We should talk. These men might look tough, but many of them struggled after coming home. Your services could help others like them." With that, Richard climbed onto the back of Marcus's motorcycle, declining the offer of a helmet with a laugh. "If my head was hard enough for Vietnam, it's hard enough for this short ride." The group roared off toward the VA hospital, Richard sitting tall behind his former second-in-command, looking for all the world like he'd shed 20 years in the space of a few minutes. Curious about what would happen, and feeling invested in Richard's story, I called my supervisor to explain I'd be late, then caught a rideshare to Rusty's Tavern. I arrived just as the procession of motorcycles pulled up outside. The veterans parked with military precision, creating a formidable wall of machines. Marcus helped Richard dismount, and together they entered the tavern, followed by 4 others. The rest remained outside, forming a perimeter that wasn't threatening, but made it clear that leaving wouldn't be an option for anyone inside who didn't have their approval. I waited across the street, not wanting to interfere, but needing to see this through. About 10 minutes later, Frank and his two companions emerged from the bar, escorted by Richard and the veterans. The change in Frank's demeanor was striking. Gone was the aggressive swagger, replaced by something that looked remarkably like respect. I couldn't hear what was said, but I watched as Frank extended his hand to Richard, who accepted it with a nod. The three younger bikers then mounted their motorcycles and rode away, not speeding off in defiance, but departing with measured restraint. Later that day, after his VA appointment, I joined Richard and his unit at the American Legion Hall. Over lunch, the story emerged. The veterans hadn't threatened violence or sought revenge. Instead, they'd surrounded Frank and his friends with living history, men who had served alongside Richard in some of the most dangerous missions of the Vietnam War. They'd told stories of Richard's leadership, how he'd saved their unit when their patrol boat came under heavy fire, how he'd carried Doc through a kilometer of jungle when he was wounded, how he'd written personal letters to the families of every man they'd lost. We just wanted them to see him, really see him, Marcus explained to me. Not as some old man at a bus stop, but as the hero we know him to be. Frank, it turned out, had a grandfather who'd served in Korea. The stories struck a chord, reminding him of values he'd once respected, but had somehow lost sight of along the way. His apology to Richard had been genuine, as had his shame. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself drawn into the brotherhood of these men. They shared stories of their service, their struggles after returning home, and the solace they found in remaining connected to each other. Some had battled PTSD, alcoholism, homelessness, the invisible wounds of war that so many veterans carry. Their motorcycle club had become more than a social group. It was a lifeline, a support system when official channels failed them. By the time evening fell, plans were in motion for several of them to visit my outreach center, both to seek services and to volunteer. Richard had become something of a bridge between generations, respected by men who had served under him decades ago, and now poised to help younger veterans navigating their own challenges. As for Frank, Richard had extracted a promise from him, not just to show respect to veterans in the future, but to visit the VA hospital as a volunteer. That young man has anger he doesn't understand, Richard told me quietly. Better he works it out by helping others than by hurting them. I left the American Legion Hall that evening with a deeper understanding of what it means to serve, not just in wartime, but in peace. Not just when in uniform, but for life. The incident at the bus stop, ugly as it had been, had created ripples of connection and healing that would touch many lives beyond those directly involved. A week later, I wasn't entirely surprised to see Frank at the outreach center, awkward but determined, asking how he could help. And beside him, offering quiet support, was Richard, the commander who understood that true leadership never stops serving. The bonds forged in military service don't break easily. They may stretch across years and miles, but when called upon, they snap back into place with a strength that few civilians can comprehend. I witnessed that strength firsthand on a cold morning at a bus stop, and in the remarkable events that followed when a unit rallied around one of their own. This story of brotherhood, redemption, and the enduring bonds between veterans reminds us all that the oaths taken in service don't expire with retirement. The ripple effects of standing up for what's right, whether it's one person at a bus stop or an entire unit arriving on motorcycles, can transform lives in unexpected ways. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to subscribe to Honor Echoes. Each week, we bring you powerful, true stories of veterans whose courage and sacrifice continue to echo through time. Hit that notification bell to never miss an upload, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of the unbreakable bonds formed in service to our country. Until next time, this is Honor Echoes, where veterans' stories live on.